Do you remember leaving the house and simply disappearing? No GPS, no message when you arrive, just the unspoken agreement that you would be back before dark. If you were born somewhere between the late 70s and the mid-80s, you grew up in a world that no longer exists, and then had to become an adult in one that arrived almost overnight. You are not quite Generation X, shaped entirely by analog independence, but you are not truly millennial either, raised inside the architecture of the internet from the beginning. You came of age in the seam between them. And living in a seam has a psychological cost, because identity usually forms from belonging to a place, a culture, a generation. But you were always slightly out of sync with both. Too young for the full cynicism of Gen X, too analog for the native digital fluency of millennials. So you learned something subtle early on. How to adapt without fully identifying. How to move between worlds without claiming either one.
This is the psychology of Zennials. And today, I want to show you exactly what that seam did to you. Before algorithms learned your preferences, boredom was a landscape you had to cross on your own. Long afternoons with nothing scheduled, nothing streaming, nothing glowing in your hand. And if you were a child then, boredom was not a failure of stimulation. It was simply Tuesday. So you invented things. Sticks became swords. Sidewalks became racetracks. Empty rooms became entire worlds. You learned, without anyone teaching it, how to generate experience from imagination alone. Psychologists today call this the default mode network, the mental state that activates when attention turns inward, when the mind wanders and creates. For you, it was just childhood. You also learned to wait, for photos to be developed, for a song to come on the radio, for a friend to show up at the agreed time. Because once you left the house, you were unreachable.
And in that waiting, something important formed. The capacity for delayed gratification, a quiet tolerance for uncertainty, the understanding that not everything arrives on demand. Your social world was physical, immediate, and unscripted. Conflict happened face to face. You learned to read a room before you ever read a thread. You learned to repair after friction rather than escape after discomfort. And you had solitude. Not loneliness, but genuine time alone with your thoughts, uninterrupted, unobserved. That childhood, now nearly extinct, left you with something rare, the ability to tolerate stillness without panic. You are among the last adults whose inner life formed in analog silence, before boredom was engineered away. And then, just as you were becoming yourself, everything shifted. Not gradually, not across generations, right in the middle of your adolescence, that fragile window when identity is still soft, still forming, still asking, who am I becoming? 1 year, connection meant a phone tethered to a wall. A few years later, it meant a glowing portal in the corner of the room, arriving with the shrill sound of a 56K modem. You were old enough to remember the before, young enough to master the after. And that combination created something psychologically rare, a kind of technological bilingualism. You learned the language of analog presence, eye contact, pauses, physical space, shared silence. And then you learned the language of digital mediation, usernames, tone conveyed through text, curated versions of yourself, connection without proximity. For you, the internet was never the air you breathed. It was a place you went. You logged on. And just as importantly, you logged off. There was a clear boundary between your physical life and your digital one. That boundary felt almost architectural. But as adulthood unfolded, it dissolved. Work moved online. Friendships moved online. And somewhere along the way, the log-off door disappeared. You still carry the memory of when it existed, when presence and absence were distinct states. That memory never left you, and it shapes everything about how you experience the always-on world you now live inside. Identity usually grows from belonging, a generation, a culture, a shared story you can point to and say, "That is mine." But if you are a Xennial, that recognition always arrived slightly out of focus. You were told you were Gen X, but you never fully shared their hardened detachment, their fully analog formation. Later, you were folded into Millennials, but you never felt native inside the digital world that defined them. So you learned to translate rather than inhabit, to move between generational spaces without fully settling into either one. Psychologically, this creates a quiet but persistent state, not fragmented, but hybrid, not lost, but unclassified. You recognize both sides of the divide. You understand the pre-internet skepticism of older cohorts and the fluid networked self of younger ones. But recognition is not the same as belonging, and over time this produces a specific self-perception. I adapt everywhere, but I originate nowhere. There is genuine strength in this position, cognitive flexibility, empathy across difference, comfort with transition. But there is also a cost, a softer anchor of identity, fewer cultural mirrors, less reinforcement that your experience forms a coherent whole. You constructed your continuity internally, from memories that span incompatible eras. Your mind learned to hold discontinuity without collapse. You are not between generations by accident. You are what a transition looks like when it becomes human. Your childhood unfolded in the long, bright afterglow of the 90s, a decade that felt, in hindsight, almost impossibly stable. The cultural story was simple. Study hard, build a career, step into a future that would be wider and safer than the past. And you believed it, because children are supposed to believe the world they inherit will hold. But just as you reached the threshold of adulthood, the timing shifted. The dot-com bubble burst as many of you were entering college or the workforce. Careers that looked inevitable dissolved. Then came September 11th, striking not at midlife, but at the exact moment of launch. First jobs, first apartments, first independent plans. The psychological message was immediate. The world can change overnight, and safety is not guaranteed by progress. And just as recovery seemed possible, the 2008 financial crisis arrived precisely when many Xennials were approaching traditional milestones, buying homes, building careers, forming families. Again, the ground shifted underfoot. These stacked disruptions left a mark that psychologists describe as cynical optimism. You still carry the hope you were raised with, the belief that effort should matter, that things can improve. But underneath it runs a steady awareness. Structures fail, systems break, timing betrays. So you plan carefully, you scan for exits, you expect change to arrive unannounced. The world did not wait until you were ready. It changed at exactly the moment you stepped forward to meet it. By midlife, many responsibilities accumulate, but for Xennials, they tend to converge all at once. Above you, parents are aging, needing more coordination, more decisions, more presence. Health systems to navigate, finances to monitor, roles slowly reversing. Below you, children are still forming, growing up in a world more complex and more exposed than the one you knew. Their needs extend beyond basic care into digital safety, emotional literacy, and navigating a future nobody can clearly map. And between these two gravitational pulls, you hold your own life in suspension. Psychologists call this role strain. Multiple high-demand roles with insufficient recovery between them. Caregiver, parent, worker, partner, mediator. Each legitimate, each urgent, each drawing from the same finite reservoir of attention and energy. But there is another layer, quieter. Generational invisibility. Support flows through you more than toward you.
You are expected to manage upward and downward simultaneously, yet rarely positioned as the central story. And slowly, a specific exhaustion takes shape. Not collapse, continuous load. The weight of holding 2 generations while still becoming yourself. There is something you carry that is becoming genuinely rare. Not nostalgia, lived memory of a human pace that existed before constant connection. You remember days that unfolded without interruption, friendships that deepened without documentation, thoughts that formed slowly, unshared and unobserved. You remember what it felt like to be unreachable, and for that to be completely ordinary. As the world moves further into continuous presence, your memories become more than personal history. They are cultural memory. Evidence that attention once had margins, that boredom once opened into imagination, that identity could form without an audience. You are among the last adults whose inner life began in that analog quiet. After you, childhood starts already connected, already searchable, already seen. And that is why your experience matters now more than ever. In a hyper-digital age, the future still needs people who remember the value of pause, of offline space, of human contact that exists without mediation. You are not invisible. You are not between generations by accident. You are continuity, a living bridge between 2 worlds, carrying the memory of one while navigating the reality of the other. Leave a comment below. If you are a Zennial, what is one analog memory you still carry? I want to hear it. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if this resonated, and I will see you in the next one.